So what I'm going to be talking today is talking about some new features in 2.2. Hopefully my voice lasts it. It's always the fun about the night before with all the party and trying to shout over everybody else talking, but we'll see how we go. So I'm actually, to full transparency, some of these features were developed during 2.2 and we backported them into 2.1 patches, so they weren't there in the original release. So I'm going to be talking about the mix. You might sort of say, hey, some of those things are still already there in 2.1, and you're correct, they just weren't there in 2.1.0. But let's get going. So my name is Alan Kent. I'm Magento Chief Architect. I'm based out of the San Jose office in the US. A lot of people have sort of said, so welcome back. I'm not from the UK. I'm actually an Aussie. But the good news is a lot of people in both Australia and the UK think I'm British, just for my accent. So, but I am an Aussie. So what I want to talk about is some of the new features that are coming, and I'm assuming this is more of a DevOpsy sort of audience, and people are interested in deployment and so forth, because that's what I'm really going to be talking about. It's not sexy new functionality, it's just about how to get deployments smoother and slicker with Magento 2. So there's a number of new features coming in 2.2. One of them is the build step. There's this sort of, I don't see anything here is going to be super amazing, but they're just practical, useful tools to make deployments easier. So one of the key steps is you no longer need to have access to a database. So if you've done used to the static asset compilation process, it used to look up the themes, and it used to look up the store views out of the database. And so it meant your build process had to have access to the database. So there's some new capabilities coming in 2.2, which the first release candidate is out. And so you don't need that database access. And we're going to see how we can make things better with that. There's also generally faster compilation and asset generation. Quite a few of these things have already been backported to 2.1 in a patch, but there are some new features coming in 2.2 as well. In particular, there's a new mode called Compact Web Assets, and we're going to go into all these features in greater detail, but in a nutshell, what it basically says is, hey, why am I copying the jQuery library for every single locale and every single theme? That just seems wasteful. And it turns out it actually speeds up the compilation process a lot, because it just reduces the amount of disk I/O you've got to do, copying all these files around, and it reduces the amount of time to transfer it from your build server over to your production server. So there's just a number of nice side effects from that one. Another one I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I'm particularly keen on, is moving towards read-only file system in production mode, which from my point of view is great from a security perspective. It's very hard to attack a site if you can't write to files on the file system. And so I'm actually really looking forward to that particular one. There's also support for environments. So the idea of environments is there's a cascading level of environment variables. Then the env.php is meant to be per environment, config.php, and there's another concept introduced called related to sensitive. I'm actually quite interested in getting feedback. Like, it's a release candidate, we can adjust things before we get to final, nothing major, but we're always looking for feedback on that release candidate. And sensitive settings might be one of those ones you might want to have a bit of a look at to see whether it makes sense for you and your sort of circumstances, and if not, give some feedback, because I'm wondering about some things. Now, how many people here have heard of 12-factor apps? It's not a Magento concept, it's just a generic concept. I only had one hand there from our Director of Operation. Oh, by the way, Mike is sitting up the front row. He's running our DevOps team internally, so he's a good one to sort of catch up with. So he's going to be doing a lot more work around like trying to test automation frameworks and that sort of stuff. That now rolls up to Mike. Wave your hand, Mike. No, he's trying to hide. Okay, so 12-factor apps, it is something that's worthwhile having a bit of a read. It's just a single web page, it's got the URL of the page there, and it talks about a whole lot of principles of what's a good sort of DevOpsy sort of set of principles to follow. And 4 of those issues are related to what we're going to be talking about here today. We've got put your code base under version control, store config should be in your environment, have separate build, release, and run stages. And they've basically got a number of principles they believe is the right way to do applications in this world of DevOps. So what I'm going to do is just run through a deployment flow. I'm assuming of people at different levels of maturity here, so I'm going to start from the basics and then try and build up to some of the new features. I'm also going to say that I don't have every single step drawn on the diagrams here. I'm trying to highlight some of the things that are coming in 2.2 in particular. But a normal sort of flow would be, you've got a development tree. Now, I always recommend having projects under source code control. Hopefully these days most people do. I know a lot in the old Magento 1 days, it was a lot more ad hoc and people just edit servers directly on production. I'm not in that camp. I always recommend having it doing development on a separate box, so if you mess anything up, you don't destroy your production server, it sort of terrorizes me, frankly. And so on the development server, we recommend having your source code in something like Git. Don't really care which one. So you get your code, you work on develop, and of course you all write automated tests for all your code, don't you? Yeah, right, okay. So that's a practice we're trying to encourage and get more of. We want to improve our own test frameworks to make that easier, and it's going to be a continual ongoing trend from us is to try and encourage people to write more and more tests to automate it. You then take your final code, you push it into Git, and then you get over onto your deployment box. Well, in the old days, you might put it into maintenance mode, grab the latest code, run the various asset compilation, the DI compile, and the static asset compile, and so forth. Upgrade the database if necessary, and take it out of maintenance mode. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is the compilation step can be slow, the web asset generation can be slow and it's tied to the database, and the database upgrade can be slow, and this was all in your downtime for your site upgrade. Not what you want. You don't want your site down for that period of time. And so what we're trying to do is to reduce that amount of time within those steps. That's the goal. So what we're moving towards is to still have your development phase, where things are happening on your laptop or similar, but to introduce a separate build stage. Now the goal is, you can do that anywhere. You can trigger it off from a Jenkins job. I don't care whether you're actually doing it on a production server, it's up to you. I personally recommend doing it somewhere separately. But so some of the improvements we made, for example, is the compilation steps. One, you can do them on a separate machine, so you'll notice it's no longer inside that maintenance window at all. It can be actually on a completely separate machine. Your web asset generation, so we have made them faster. A lot of those changes, the speed improvements have already been backported to 2.1, so jumping to 2.2, you should see a little bit of speed improvement, but it's not going to be massive. A lot of that's already in the later 2.1 patches. So if you're not using the latest 2.1 patch, there are speed improvements for those steps already there. But just by getting rid of the database dependency means you can run it off in a Jenkins server, whereas before that wasn't really convenient. Some people would actually build a database server, insert a few records into it, just so they can get it on a separate machine. It worked, but it's a little bit clunky, so that's one of the areas we've cleaned up. And the other one is the compact deployment coming in 2.2. It just makes it faster to run these commands. I've also got that extra step in there, which is the test automation. What we want to encourage people to be able to do is to run all those tests you had while you were developing, also run them on your production code. And the reason for that is, if you're testing over in development, if you're using develop mode, it's not exactly the same code as in production mode. And so you really want to tire out the stuff that you're going to deploy into production, and you want to run all your tests on that. And so that's why we've got the test automation step there after doing all the compilation steps. Now, you notice we've still got the database upgrade, and the reason it can be slow there, because it's not always slow, it just depends if your change is deploying, if it's a major change and you have to rebuild some indexes, well then it takes longer. And so the other two stages that we've got out of that maintenance window, so the maintenance window now is a lot shorter, and if you're not doing a database schema upgrade, it can actually be fast. Now, there's a number of ways to switch to code, and a lot of people are trying different ways of deploying Magento, and I'm not at this stage saying there is only one way to do it, and that's why I'm just saying switch the code over. Some people use a symlink, some people would flip a different config file in, some people would swap a different server in. There's no single right way. One thing that we are going to be trying to do is encouraging some best practices, and so publish some best practices. Doesn't mean you have to do it that way, but we just want to give a template for people to follow more easily. But there is a step further we'd like to go. This is not in 2.2. We may get it into 2.2 patch if we can, but it's not fully there yet. Which is, love to get a check in this deployment process to check if the database needs a schema upgrade. Now, I'm going to show you some other data that we're putting into the database that's related to removing the database dependency in the web asset generation. And that changes mean that, so we've actually got a command already that checks the database schema, but it doesn't check all the new features yet. So there's a slight gap there. But what the goal is to say that most of the time you don't need a database upgrade. If I'm just fixing an if statement in the code, there's no database changes at all. Can I get it so I can do an atomic switch in production? Like if I'm just flipping a server over to another server, you may not need any downtime. And that to me is utopia. Can I get to a zero downtime installation and deployment? So just to talk about the summary boosts very quickly then, just as a review. So we've done a number of optimizations to the compilation processes. Most of them are backported already. The web asset generation is faster, most are backported. The new compact deployment, should definitely look at using that. It does make things surprisingly faster. And also able to run on a separate build server without the database available. So let's look at some of these commands in a little bit more detail. So the static asset compilation, so not highly scientific tests, but some tests that we ran internally just to give you an idea of the speed boosts. A site with 3 locales ran twice as fast. The more interesting one is a site with 15 locales ran 10 times faster. So it's particularly useful for those sites, European sites in particular with lots of locales to different countries. That's when you're going to start getting your real speed boosts. And it's basically because it's not copying so many files per environment when the files are the same. So it's all the jQuery, all those JavaScript libraries. We still need to test if you have done any localization per locale. So we can't completely get rid of the step, but it does go a lot faster. So how that actual duplication works is if you look into it, there's now actually a map.php file, and there'll be a require.js map.js file. And what these files do is, so when you've got the old URL, we provide some PHP and JavaScript functions to map the old URLs onto the real URLs. And so there's a new base directory, it's got all the files in the base directory, and so if it was per locale and it doesn't need it per locale, there's a lookup table that says, no, go use it out of the base directory. So part of it was to try and keep it backwards compatible with the old code base rather than having too much impact. Now, one thing I do want to say is I haven't talked about all the new features available. I'm just talking about one walkthrough. It is worthwhile running through all the new command line options and so forth. For example, there's a new option called keep generated. So what some people like to do is they do all the compilation and they git commit those assets and put it into the Git repository instead. And then if you go over onto a production server, you don't want to regenerate them again. And so there's a command line option, for example, keep generated, which says don't touch that directory, do the upgrades, but keep all those generated files around. So there are a number of different options around. It is worthwhile browsing through all of them. So one of the other, I mentioned 12-factor apps before, but part of the idea is to say your configuration should be in code as much as possible. And the idea of that is you want it under, if you put it under source code control, you've got like an audit history of exactly what gets deployed. And that's one of the reasons you use Git to transfer it from your development environment across to your build environment, is because now I know exactly what I'm going to build. I've got in Git, you may automatically put a tag on it or something like that with a deployment date or something like that. And so you've got a much more better degree of auditability and repeatability of your deployments. So what we've got in the config.php, there was the old enabling of modules that was always there. There is also now scope information. That's information like your websites, your stores, and the store views. And by getting this information into this configuration file is how the web asset compilation phase got rid of the database dependence. It gets it out of that config file instead. There is also other various store configuration settings, like do I want to minify my JavaScript, do I CSS, all these other settings you go through the store configuration page. All the information you want to share, you can now put in the config.php file, and that you put under source code control and push. So let's just run through some of these in a little bit more detail. So you can imagine having a developer, and he's using the module enable and module disable commands. And what that basically does is updates the config.php file. You then For another developer, hidden under the thing, for another developer, you can just use Git to share that to other developers working on the same project, and then the build process would bundle that up to ship out. So there's no single way of the actual distribution file. You may use a zip file, you may use SCP, you may use Git. It's really up to you to work out what's the best way to push it out. But the result of the build process will include the config.php file, which also gets shipped out to all the other environments. So the goal is all environments should be using the same configuration as much as possible. This is actually one of the other 12-factor apps, is to say, look, environments should be as similar as possible to minimize the differences between your development and your production, to make sure what you're developing and testing on every day is what you're using. So the other one was scopes and themes, which we talked about before. They need to be in the database because we actually use them in the database for things like foreign key validation. So that's why they were there in the first place. But the sort of the change we've got now is to say, well, I want them under source code control. If I want to create a new locale, we actually want to know that during the build process. And so to push it between environments, you're actually now going to put it into, just got the picture on the next slide. You're going to put it into the config file, and so that's how we distribute it between environments. And so when you, is there anything else there? No, I'll just jump on to the next slide. So what we're going to do is use your admin to define your website stores and store views as per normal. You then, there's a new command called app-config-dump, and what it will do is it will go through your database and copy those values into the config.php file for you. You can do it by hand if you want to, but this is just a useful command to run it, and then you can, I personally would then do a git diff to sort of see what changes it's doing and review them before actually committing them. But that's one of the new features that's now available in 2.2. There is another command called app-config-import, and so what it will do is it'll read from the config.php file and put them into the database. And so that's one of the new things that we also need to check, if you remember previously about that decision, to say, has the database schema changed? Well, that's the sort of thing that, one of the areas that we haven't actually got quite done yet. And so that's now how I can keep my different sites in sync about what websites and so forth exist. Now, the actual other commands like the setup upgrade for your production sites, it also automatically imports this, and it will create all the indexes and all those sorts of steps if required. Now, most of the time you don't create a new locale, but the idea is now I can push the locales between environments much more consistently. Okay, so the other one is another sort of, it's really a refinement of what we had before, but there's now a multi-level fallback scheme for configuration settings. So they're first checks for environment variables, so it's got underscores, all caps, and so we'll check to see if it can find a particular named environment variable. If so, it'll use that. If it can't, it'll look for a setting in env.php, and the idea is the env.php file is then per environment. So you'd have one for your own development box, other people would have their own development box, so if you've got different database ports and so forth, that's the sort of stuff that goes into your env.php. But the goal is to keep that file as small as possible, so you've got as minimal differentiation between environments as possible. Then it falls back to your config.php, then it'll go back to the database settings, and the absolute default is a config.xml, which you should never touch. It's a file that we ship for the defaults for these various settings. So, you know, it's not rocket science, it's just a multi-level fallback scheme, but it gives you the power then to control what you want to do per environment versus what is going to be shared across environments. So when we actually write the file settings out, so one of the changes in 2.2 is when you write the settings to a config or an env.php, we actually mark them as locked. And so if you go into the admin interface, you can't actually change them in the admin interface when they're in these files. This is one of the changes in 2.2, because we want to say, look, these settings are now owned by those configuration files, and in production, we don't want any changes to source code going on for security reasons. We want to get it so that all your PHP code and all your JavaScript files, now your media directory you need to be able to write to because you've got new images you're uploading, but we want to encourage people to try and set all the rest up to be read-only. The idea would be owned by a different account than the web user account, because then if somebody breaks into your web server, heavens forbid if there's a bug, they can't modify the file system. And it would make a huge difference from a security perspective. That and just setting a good password for your admin account. The number one exploit we see for the for sites is they just don't have a good admin account. And I think somebody's worked out how many seconds it was before spinning up a new AWS node before the bots discovered it was a Magento site and started trying to break in. It was measured in the seconds, which is a bit scary. So how does it work in practice? Well, again, you'd be setting up all your information in your store configuration. There is also a Magento config set command. It also sets it in the database by default. It doesn't matter which one you do. If you want to script it, you may want to use a config set command. When you do the dump, these settings, some of them get written out to the env.php file by default because we believe that they're local to an environment. And other ones get written out to config.php. You can change those settings using there's a di.xml setting to control where it goes where. We've got a set of default settings that we use. You can then, so as before, the config.php will get pushed via Git to a local environment or via the build process to another environment, and that effectively locks it from then on. So what happens if you do want to change it locally? Well, the config set command actually has a lock command, and what it basically says is even though this setting is locked, or you could interpret it as I want to lock this setting, it'll write it out to the local env.php file. So what that means is if you do want a deployment script, and part of that deployment script is going to set some local settings, there are some commands around to help with that. There is also the concept, which I haven't talked too much about, we've got this concept called sensitive settings, and the idea is these are meant to be like passwords. There's settings you're going to be a bit more careful about. You don't want them to going into your Git repository, and so there's a reminder in effect to say this is sensitive. Now, one of the examples of the debates we've been having internally is when I did the dump command, should we be writing those out to the env.php file, or should we say, no, they're just too sensitive, we're not going to write them out anyway? That's one we're a little bit undecided on. At the moment, it writes them out to the env.php file, but if you haven't looked, feedback welcome. So just wanted to talk about, so that's the end of the sort of the new deployment commands in terms of the flow. But I was just going to talk a little bit about recommended practices to the overall flow, and as I said, there's no single right way to do it, but this is an approach that we quite like. So you set up your project, you have a Git repository, you should always commit your composer.json file, you should always commit your composer.log file. What the log file does is it says, these are the exact versions of these modules that I'm going to do. When you want to go through the build process, one of the commands I skipped over because it's not really relevant to this talk was the composer install command to download all those components. So we generally recommend don't commit your whole vendor directory, just commit everything but your vendor directory in effect. And so the composer.log command sort of guarantees that when I run composer later on, it'll get exactly the same versions of all those modules. If you don't commit to composer.log, what you can end up with is your production server is running a different version of the modules than what you tested with, which is not what we recommend. So once you've got your main project under Git control, you may go off to a marketplace, buy some more extensions. You can either add it through the admin or do a composer requirement. It basically adds them into the composer.json file. But there's an interesting pattern that we're seeing more and more of, is SIs are building modules and they want to share them across multiple projects. And sometimes you may just want to do it for your own development purposes, but Composer supports the approach of having one Git repo per module that you develop. And you can actually put a reference of that into your composer.json file. Interesting side effects of that is, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but you can actually get Composer to do a checkout of the code. It'll actually put it onto your vendor directory, but it's actually used Git to get it, and so you can actually make local changes and do a Git commit and push them back. And so you don't have the code underneath that code, you actually have it in the separate Git repositories. If you use like a GitHub or a Bitbucket private repo, you can also have a public build process, and it'll actually grab those files as well. But I did want to put in a slight shout out to Packagist. Packagist also got a private repo capability. If you don't know the Packagist guys, they're the guys who wrote Composer. So, you know, they do a great job. They're just supporting the whole PHP community. And this is a commercial venture they're doing. So they've got a Composer a cache service. So, you know, check them out. They help everybody else. And sort of, at least they deserve to get a little bit of people having a look at what they're doing. But the other sort of aspect I was talking about, using Git with Composer will actually check out your code. There's this concept of prefer source. And what it does is it says, if I can find the source code, I'll grab the source code. If I can't, then I'll grab the distribution. Now, when we put all of the Composer packages up for the core Magento, we only make them available as zips at present, which means they'll always download in distribution mode. Distribution mode gets cached, which makes the next Composer run very, very fast. The other ones do not. But so you can either say prefer a source, but you can also in the composer.json file, you can actually tell it your preference. So you can say like, all the things from my company, I normally want to get via Git, so I can actually make changes and commit the changes back. And all the other ones get via the distribution format, so it's more efficient to download and cache. So there's some options there with Composer to make your workflow a bit faster. So this is where I'm just getting into a bit more general recommendations. I'm just going to burl through these fairly quickly. Happy to talk about them more if anybody's got questions later. But some things to think about. One is, if you're going to have a build server, don't forget you need to update that periodically. So how are you going to build those jobs? The Nets 98 one, for example, says, I'm going to download Composer every time because Composer changes. So they don't pre-install it, the actual build process grabs it. That makes a bit of sense. If you're going to do a Git clone and pull and you want to have a separate Jenkins server or something or other, you need to think about your keys and how you're going to manage the keys because it needs to get access to that repo. Composer install, it uses a cache directory. It's usually Tilta, it's in your home directory. But you want to make sure if you've got a build server, you want to keep that directory between Jenkins runs. Otherwise, it's going to re-download all the Magento from the Magento site every single build process. It just takes too long. You also need to decide what you want to do with your test files. Do you want them in your deployment bundle going on to production or not? It's a consideration. Part of the challenges there is I want to run all my test automation on to production files. And so I haven't actually quite made up my own mind there whether I want them there or not, because I don't want them executable in production, but I want to be able to test my production deployments. You also need to think about, are you going to have a separate staging environment, your production environment, even if you just spin up a node for a while, deploy the code there, try it all out, and then shut it down. You do want the environments as close as possible, which means minimizing what goes into the env.php file. I would have a look, if you're designing your own build system, I would have a look at trying to make the file system read-only. So one of the changes in 2.2 is var generated used to contain PHP code. We've pulled that out into a separate generator directory, so you can make var is to say, okay, var is read-write. It's got caching files and other temporary files that you need to have in production, but everything else can now be read-only except for your media directory. You do need to think about your configuration settings. That includes also extensions, whether the extensions are using the same sort of configuration settings. It is also worthwhile remembering that we've talked about one way to use config.php and env.php, but they are executable code. You can hook them up to any other system you like. If you've got your own configuration management system or your own database system or you're using console with Kubernetes or something or other, they are executable files. You can write some different code there instead. We recommend having a build phase. You've got to think about how you're going to swap your files in. Are you going to use symlinks or change config files and so forth? Varnish has got some modes like serve stale content out of the cache. Can be useful during the switchover so that you actually leave it on and it will actually, even if the site goes down for a short period of time, you can still serve up your old content until it also helps with if you just wipe the cache, you can get a sudden spike in your hit on your server, and so it sort of flattens out the load during deployment. There are lots of options, and obviously we've got our own hosting provider. You can go with a provider that actually got more Magento knowledge, or you've got the more generic sort of technologies. But if I just run through some, I'm not going to go through all of this, but very quickly, if I just sort of hit the main points, you use your admin to create all your store views and your websites. You're going to disable modules by config.php. You set up your configuration settings. You're going to commit to config.php. The env.php file is local per environment. Sensitive settings would also put in env.php. Now, an environment variable is just the same as env.php. You just decide whatever's easier for your environment. Commit your config.php file. So then when you go heading over into production, you're going to grab that config.php file in the other environments. There's the app config import to get those settings into your database. You need to remember that one in the new mode to make sure that your server has got the new locales or themes. There is a sensitive command. There's a new concept of locked. So if it's in a config file, you can't change them. You're still going to update the database schemas mode, and looking forward to getting that one out of it. We flush your caches and go live. So just to wrap up what's coming next, well, we've got these new commands in there. What we want to do is to detect if the schema's changed, so you can actually try and avoid taking the site down at all. That's something we're going to explore still, so we don't have a solution for that yet, but that's where we want to get to. We've also got a new schema feature coming in the future, which is more declarative schemas. And what it can do is you say, this is what the schema should be, and so instead of running several upgrade scripts one by one, which can be a bit slower, it actually works out the old schema and the new schema and does a single upgrade, a single jump between them, so it will make it a little bit faster. And we want to come up with a recommended template to say, here is our recommended practice to go through the various steps. So this is something we're going to do. We'd love to get community feedback on that. There's some great projects out there already. There's the MagentoLive 2, there's a Capistrano project. Some of these projects, they're great community projects, and these are the features we want to support them. So that was my run through. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions, which I'll direct off to somebody else to answer. No, sorry. Any questions? And I believe, is there somebody with a mic? There is. Thank you very much, sir. Any questions?
So you mentioned that now you can do basically an upgrade as long as it doesn't touch a database schema. Is there any work being done at the moment to make it so you could, even if you were touching the database?
Not at this stage. It's all a matter of iteratively trying to step forward. And so the problem is, and when I say the database, we've also got to watch out for things like Redis caches and other things that change your data format. So I just don't want to detail out. At the moment, no. Is the simple answer. It's a much tougher problem to be able to have, like, are you going to have two sets of code trying to deal with it? Like, if you want to like do a rolling deploy, and you'd like to have, well, then what do I do? Spin up some new code, but I've got the old code, and so there's standard approaches to doing that. But what you have to be able to do is you upgrade the code so it can support both the old scheme and the new scheme, and then you can upgrade the database schema, and you do this multi-level step. But it's really complicated. Like, it's what the SaaS people do, but at the moment, we just want to get the basics out and going. Once we get that bedded down and just get those ones, we'll look at them, but not at the moment.
Okay, thanks.
Uh-oh.
Hi, Alan.
I
have a question. So earlier you said that end.php will be locked as a file with no modifications from admin panel. In the end.php file, we also have varnish IP and port. For example, we're running varnish server separated from Magento server. And sometimes, as part of after-scaling group, we create additional varnish instance in, I don't know, any other availability zone, right? And it's additional IP. So my question is, if end.php, and maybe I missed this part, so double check. If we would need to add additional varnish IP, will it be possible with the Magento command, or it's end.php is locked like forever?
So what I was talking about with the end.php is when you go to the admin interface. There was a follow-up question over here at the front. The end.php locks it in the admin interface. So when you go to the admin interface, you can't accidentally change a setting there and then wonder what the hell's going on. It's not using it because the end.php overrides it. So the end.php, it's just a PHP file. So if you want to change it, if you've locked a read-only file system, it's hard to change, which I'd encourage in production. And so I'd actually go through and do another deployment. Or you can use environment variables to change it, but it's not that you're not allowed to ever change the end.php. That's just files, you're allowed to change as you wish. All I was talking about is in the admin, if you go and try and change settings, it'll warn you to sort of say, I'm sorry, this is the current value I've picked up out of a config file. And so what it allows you to do, for example, is to say, the developer can decide what a merchant can touch on a site. So you can stop your merchants from getting in and fiddling with settings that you don't want them to because they don't have access to the source code. That make sense?
Regarding the var-generated file. So currently, we see that there are also some files generated when I, for example, log into the backend, even if I deployed the code before properly. So you say that there won't be any PHP files generated on the fly like it is today?
It should not.
It should not.
It should not. It should not be generating any new files after all the compilation stuff. So if you give it a try as 2.2 and you find it's still happening, please let us know. Particularly during the RC, we'll get it fixed.
So you can completely put it to read-only?
Yes, that is absolutely the goal. So for our cloud...
That's awesome, because I also thought that is a big security issue.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any final question? Otherwise, thank you very much.